NIU. Thank you for inviting me to speak today about the Woodland Period in Illinois. I apologize for not being able to present this lecture in person, but I hope to make it as interesting as possible. My name is Pete Geraci. I have been an archaeologist for the past 20 years. I have previously worked for the Illinois State Archaeological Survey and now work for UW-Milwaukee Department of Anthropology as an administrator and researcher. I'm also an independent GIS and graphic design consultant who works with CRM companies and researchers. I got into archaeology right out of high school, and my first experience working on an excavation had a lasting effect on me, and in a way has led me to talk to you today. My first field school took place in a sleepy river town at a site called the Buried Gardens of Campsville in the lower Illinois Valley. It was hot, muggy, mosquito infested, and amazing. The program was run by the Center for American Archaeology, and I was so inspired by my time there that I decided to pursue it as a career. I later learned when I was in college that I had chosen a field school with a long history, one that was very much entwined with the notion of the Woodland Period.
Has been run by Northwestern University archaeologist Stuart Strever.
Campsville was a major river port back in the 19th century, all the way up till about 1920. When I came here 22 years ago, it was an abandoned town almost, and we've taken over 39 buildings, made it into a permanent archaeological research and teaching center. And it's an ideal place because you can bring scholars and students together away from the madhouse of the everyday urban world.
Before I get into the nitty-gritty, I first want to point out the problematic nature of using terms like woodland or archaic or period, stage, tradition, or even Illinois for that matter. While I recognize these terms are useful in an educational format, they should only be used as shorthand for conveying a point quickly and generally. They do very little for us analytically. The terms can create divisions where division may not exist, or they can obscure our ability to see change as fluid in time and space and miss the very thing that we should be focusing on, which are how do humans live? How do they adapt? How do they think? What I'll try to do here is walk that fine line between using these terms as shorthand, but also try to focus in on the regional diversity and more humanistic views of the people we are trying to study. Okay, so today I'm going to give a general overview of each sub-period, highlighting phases, sites, and cultural artifacts from the northern half of the state, with a special focus on northeastern Illinois, which is my area of expertise. As you've read, the Woodland Period is roughly 2,000-year time period between 3,000 and 1,000 years ago, when indigenous cultures all over the Midwest began to formalize and institutionalize the traditions they had been developing for thousands of years. It was also a time when new technologies such as ceramics and the bow and arrow proliferated across much of the eastern US, as well as the building of earthen monuments we commonly call mounds.
One major excavation is concentrating on a group of burial mounds directly in the path of the road. In charge of this part of the program is Northwestern University's Jane Bykestra.
Here we've walked into the middle of a 2,000-year-old mound. What we have here is a trench that we've excavated, expanding upon a trench that was dug about 50 years ago by parties unknown who would have been looking for artifacts deep within the mound. For instance, this is an example of a type of object we might expect to find with those individuals buried in the center of the mound. It's a hopewell bowl, dates to about 150 AD, and as you can see is a very finely crafted item, typical of the kinds of things, the pipes and the points and so forth, we might find in the central part of the mound.
Additionally, intensive gathering of wild plants in some places led to advances in small-scale horticulture and the domestication of starchy grains, oily seeds, and wild rice. By the end of the period, intensive corn agriculture was being practiced in places like the American Bottom. Of course, these major shifts in behavior did not occur everywhere at the same time, and in some cases, not at all. It is this variability in behavior that is so fascinating. For example, why was there such an explosion of cultural output from the central Illinois Valley around 2,000 years ago? What social, political, ecological, ideological factors may have motivated this behavioral change, and in what ways? These types of questions are really fun to ask and have greater anthropological implications regarding complexity, ethnogenesis, adaptation, gender, kinship, religiousness. But before we can start to address them, we must first familiarize ourselves with the archaeological record of Illinois and beyond. This is Illinois in the greater Midwest and Great Lakes. It sits in the middle of the North American continent in a region called the interior lowlands. It is roughly bound by the geographic features such as the Mississippi River, Great Lakes, and Ohio rivers, as well as the Great Plains, Appalachian Mountains, and the southern coastal plain. Illinois is obviously a Euro-American concept established in 1818. However, the modern boundaries of the state are largely geographic and in some ways mere ancient divisions. Archaeologists have further broken Illinois into several smaller regions, such as the American Bottom, northeastern Illinois, and west central Illinois, as a way to sort of bind their study universes using a combination of geographic and cultural attributes. This can be a helpful practice, however, it can also be a trap and limit your ability to see connections beyond, so fair warning. The environmental landscape of Illinois during the Woodland period is not well understood, but it is generally accepted that aside from the small deviations, the climate and environment were similar to what it was when European explorers first entered the territory in the late 18th century. Most of the state was dominated by tallgrass prairie, except for forested areas along major tributaries and patchy groves of nut-bearing trees such as oak, hickory, and walnut, located near upland water sources. There were, of course, many areas of wetlands contained within the floodplains of the major rivers, such as the Illinois, Mississippi, and to a lesser degree, poorly drained till plains on the moraines. During the Archaic period, people were primarily subsisting off of deer, fish, mussels, small mammals, and an assortment of wild plants collected in a seasonal pattern. This subsistence strategy persisted for most of the Woodland period as well, except for some areas such as the Illinois Valley, where intensive gathering may have led to early advances in horticulture.
The river forms the main artery of an immensely rich ecological zone. A husband and wife team of botanists, David and Nancy Ash, are intrigued especially by the seed plants that grow along the shoreline of the river. Today they are visiting an island to check on a plant which grows well in the sandy soil of the river's edge.
David, there's some over here.
Called Chenopodium, or goosefoot, it yields an abundance of small black seeds that can be ground into flour.
Seeds are starting to ripen. See?
Another plant, iva, or sumpweed, also grows in wild stands along the valley floor. On expeditions like this, the Ashes can collect several pounds of seeds an hour. Sumpweed seeds are almost as unappetizing as their name, but the Ashes have found that removing the husks and boiling the seeds makes them palatable. And they are very nutritious, rich in proteins, fat, and minerals. One of the most remarkable discoveries made by the Ashes comes from an examination of the plant debris found in archaeological sites. The material is sifted to reveal the seeds it contains. Sumpweed seeds from a period earlier than the Hopewell mound-building culture are small, about the same as today's. But Hopewell period seeds are 2 to 3 times larger. The only explanation is that people were selecting larger seeds to plant. This is a revolutionary idea, for it suggests the Hopewell people, in effect, invented an agriculture based on the cultivation and selection of the wild plants in their environment. This would have greatly increased the land's productivity and the number of people it could support.
I do also want to note quickly here that people may have had a bigger impact on the structure of the physical environment than we have previously given credit for. It is becoming increasingly likely that they were actively protecting, encouraging, and planting high-value species in their catchments. It is also thought that it was common practice to burn areas of the prairie to promote growth of particular species, as well as to drive game animals. The Woodland period in Illinois obviously doesn't begin out of nowhere. It develops out of the preceding late Archaic period. And in early portions of the Woodland Period, we see a continuation of many of these behaviors or traditions, except for some notable additions. First and foremost is the adoption of ceramic technology sometime around 2,800 years ago. Surprisingly, ceramics had already been in use in the Savannah River Valley in Georgia since at least 4,500 years ago. It's not totally clear why it took so long for the technology to diffuse to Illinois, but when it was finally adopted around 1,000 years ago, it quickly spread throughout the Midwest and Great Lakes region. It's thought that prior to ceramics, people would cook in watertight baskets with hot rocks. And in some areas in the Mid-South and East, stone bowls made from steatite. Perhaps people were experimenting with clay prior to Marion, but its pace wasn't strong enough to withstand the harsh winters of the Midwest, let alone 2,000 years in the ground. Prior to 200 BC, the people of the region mostly made small, undecorated vessels for use in only a narrow range of tasks. Woodland potters between 200 BC and 8600 made almost all of their domestic pots in a single generalized form, the shape of which changed somewhat over time. This form was a simple, wide-mouthed, earthenware jar with almost no constriction at the throat and only a slight shoulder. Their gross morphology and construction, their ubiquity in all of domestic refuse, and the association of entire fragmented vessels with a wide range of food waste all point to a primary use of these jars as an all-purpose cooking container. The potters made large and small vessels with either thick or thin walls. However, their statistical preferences for making thicker versus thinner walled vessels changed significantly over time. This has been shown by Braun in a number of articles in the 80s. The first known ceramic type or ware found in Illinois is known as Marion thick. Marion thick wares are conoidal in shape, tempered with coarsely ground rock or grit, and typically decorated in cord marking on the outer surface. Although sometimes it can be on the upper portion of the interior surface. Marion thick is found all over the Midwest and Great Lakes, and in Illinois is often associated with stem projectile point knives, commonly referred to as Kramer points. That said, there is some regional variation in the use of stemmed or notch points, and there always seems to be some overlap from region to region, phase to phase, such as Wabasa points, which are very similar to Kramer but have more of a curved base to them. In a few rare cases, Marion thick wares and Kramer points were found in association with burials covered in red ochre and accompanied with copper tools, slate pendants, exotic shells, and jewelry. The red ochre burial complex is interesting because it combines some of the preceding late archaic traditions, such as glacial cane and old copper, but included new aspects such as ceramic inclusion and the use of burial mounds rather than pits on natural rises. Begg and Riley, 1990, conducted a petrographic analysis of Marion thick ceramics and found a stunning similarity in pace, construction throughout the Midwest. This may be because of an open society or because the novel nature of ceramics as a whole. A few centuries after pottery was adopted, a new ware type was introduced along the Mississippi River called black sand. Black sand may have originated further south as it shares similarities to pottery found in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Black sand pottery has a different temper than Marion ware and is decorated with incised lines, sometimes grouped into geometric designs. A typical black sand pot has a medium texture, grit tempering, sometimes with sand or crushed chert grit, flattened lip, a horizontal row of punched out nodes, and medium wide to medium deep to deep incised lines superimposed on a somewhat smooth cord roughened surface. A recent study by Kirsty Emerson has identified a number of varieties of black sand pottery in the valley, and there are even more outside of Illinois, such as Prairie and Dane incised in Wisconsin. Some makers of the Liverpool variety of black sand pottery utilize some of the same territory as Marion ware makers in the Illinois River Valley, and likely influenced them enough to encourage the adoption of decoration on their pots. A few hundred years after the introduction of Marion ware, people in the valley began creating a new ware called Morton incised, a sort of hybrid between the two different traditions. Morton incised ware is similar to black sand, but really has nodes and are typically made with more care and precision, according to Kirsty Emerson. I think it's easy to understand why decoration was quickly adopted. The ability to express ideas through images or sets of standardized marks would be a potent way to transmit information across large areas. I believe this had a strong impact on society. Early pots must have been highly valued objects, and the potters highly valued for their knowledge and skill. For much of the early woodland and part of the middle woodland period, there was a regional division in pottery traditions, with black sand variants dominant in the Mississippi River Valley and Morton size dominant in the Great Lakes and northeastern portions of the state. These two variants were eventually replaced by Havana wares, beginning around 200 BC in the Central Valley and later elsewhere. Another major development during the early woodland period was the construction of burial mounds and the establishment and formalization of a burial program. Prior to this time, people were not often buried in formal cemeteries, although they do exist. But they were just typically buried in a flexed or shallow pit with a few special items to join them in their journey, such as stone, bone, or copper tools and jewelry, pieces of galena, or maybe a marine shell gorget. One of the best known early woodland mound groups is the Morton Group in Fulton County, Illinois. The Morton Group is important because it was one of the first mound sites where early woodland pottery was documented. In Mound F11, Cole and Duell found small sherds of thick-walled, rough rock, tempered, cord-marked pottery in association with the red ochre burials. They call this pottery type 6 and is now known as Marion Thick. Along with red ochre stained burials in this mound, they found a number of objects that harken back to the old copper and glacial cane complexes. Both adults and children were included in this mound. In one case, an infant was buried with a large leaf-shaped point and a broken shell gorget necklace. Several decades after Cole and Duell excavated Morton, Patrick Munson revisited the evidence collected from several early woodland sites in the valley, which is in one of the articles that I recommended you guys read. He argued based on the evidence available that the Marion phase is minimally defined as the association of Kramer points and Marion thick pottery and represents the non-mortuary cultural component of the late portion of the red ochre burial complex. Evidence is growing that while Havana was developing the Central Valley, the lower portions of the valley were largely vacant, with likely seasonal intrusions by people of black sand tradition. Black sand and its regional variants along the Mississippi and portions of south central Wisconsin continued on well past the initial Havana phase in the Central Valley. It is likely that these people living in other parts of the state at this time, such as northeastern Illinois, were also stuck in the early woodland until the Havana people began to migrate into the area around 2,200 years ago. All right, so we have established that the early woodland period begins around 2,800 years ago. It lasts for about 500 years, or roughly 25 generations. It begins with the introduction of Marion, and by 2600, we have the introduction of black sand into the valleys, and shortly thereafter, Morton and size. And by roughly 2,200 years ago, we have the first signs of the formulation of what we refer to as the Havana tradition and the beginning of the Middle Woodland period. The Middle Woodland period is characterized by an intensification of behavioral patterns established during the preceding early woodland and late Archaic periods. Specifically, people began constructing large, complex conical burial mounds with internal astrological alignments, crafting highly decorative personal items and ceramic vessels, producing bladelets and oversized stylistic bifaces, and participating in a pan-regional trade network called the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. Havana and Havana Hopewell are my favorite traditions to study. They were artistic, passionate people who were not afraid to experiment or expend energy to create something important. Their pottery, stone pipes, tools, jewelry, and burial methods were beautiful, intentional, and rich in meaning. These were my people. They had style. The Havana culture derives its name from the present-day town of Havana, situated on the banks of the Illinois River in the Central Valley at the site of a major woodland village in Mound Group. The term Hopewellian is used to underscore the similarities of Middle Woodland trade goods and mortuary ritual artifacts. and mortuary activities discovered at the mound and earthwork of Captain M.C. Hopewell's farm in south central Ohio. Havana is our local regional participant in the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. Other regional traditions include Crab Orchard in the southern Illinois and Indiana, Trempolo in northern Mississippi Valley, Goodall in northern Indiana and southeastern Michigan, the Scioto tradition in south central Ohio, and Marksville, Copena, and Swift Creek traditions in the southern coastal plain. It's important to point out that the Havana tradition begins before the Hopewell Interaction Sphere, and mortuary traditions become popular. The Havana tradition is recognized in the archaeological record by a number of different styles of pottery that appear around 2,200 years ago. First with Betty and Size and Sisters Creek punctate, then later Natiler and Naples and Hummel stamped, with occasional zoning right when Hopewell influence takes off around 2,000 years ago. One of the hallmarks of the Middle Woodland period is the growth of population within the valley and eventually outside of it. With a growing population, a system or number of systems needed to be developed to organize the use of the land and resources. Evidence from the CAA and other studies in the valley show a pattern in the distance between major mound groups and bluff-based villages.
It begins to look like the valley was actually populated extensively enough to have it divided off into permanent subsistence territories where people would gather their plants and their animal foods. Approximately 10 miles of river frontage, say, to each stable group with a base village and a mortuary cemetery mound group associated and various extractive camps in the environment. Probably 50 people per mile of river frontage 2,000 years ago here. And I must say that for this county, present day has less people living in it than it did 2,000 years ago. It was a very rich natural zone.
In the beginning of the period, sites were much more spread out along the valley. But by the end, or perhaps the height of the Middle Woodland period, they were much closer together, and entirely new regions of the landscape were inhabited on a consistent basis, such as the Lower Valley and northeastern Illinois. Intensive investigation of parts of the central and lower valleys by Striever and the CAA identified a wide range of sites and attempted to establish a model of settlement in the Illinois Valley and beyond. Striever's basic model included site types such as base settlements, summer agricultural camps, regional exchange centers, mound groups, burial camps, and so on. Several attempts at modifying the simplified model have been undertaken since. It now appears that during the Middle Woodland period, people were utilizing almost every aspect of the environment, from lush floodplains to dissected uplands kilometers away from the main valley. In 1990, Ken Farnsworth found that similar settlement strategies were practiced in smaller tributary rivers that flowed into the Illinois, such as the Macoupin. However, the number, size, and diversity of sites were much lower. I hypothesized that a different settlement strategy was practiced in northeastern Illinois. Sites in this region tend to be small, temporary campsites that are used numerous times over a long period of time, such as the Couch site, or specialty burial sites, such as Adler and Utica. While sites like Utica and Adler contain numerous mounds on a bluff edge, no associated village areas have been documented. This could be due to the fact that these sites were dug very early on in the 20th century, mostly as salvage operations, and there wasn't the time or access to search for them. It could also be that these groups were more like the regional trade centers or corporate burial grounds for a number of widely spaced groups living throughout the region. If we were to find a base camp such as the Snyder's Village in northeastern Illinois, we would expect to find a wide variety of artifacts, maybe features, and maybe a midden. Storage pits were a common feature type identified at that site. These pits were identified as being Hopewell in origin due to the whole Havana plain storage jars found in them. Another refuse pit was located 3 feet from 3 semi-flex burials in an oval-shaped feature interpreted as a house. Inside the pit was a large Wabesa point, inside a large vessel with a crosshatched rim, rocker stamped body, and a row of dentates between the rim and the shoulder. One of the more fascinating features includes a refuse pit which Perino describes as a child's playthings, including a small pot, a plumette, platform pipe fragment, Snyder's point, a small hoe, a polished antler section, and half a stone celt. So around 2,000 years ago, there's something like a Big Bang culturally that occurs throughout the Midwest, not just in the Illinois Valley. Things are popping off in Ohio, parts of Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, Kentucky. Raw materials of symbolic importance such as copper, marine shell, galena, obsidian, mica, grizzly bear teeth, shark teeth, exotic birds, as well as finished items made from these materials were being traded all over the mid-continent, with most of them ending up as burial offerings in Illinois and Ohio. So what's going on here? As I wrote in my thesis, there are a number of competing theories. Carr and Chase, looking at the problem from the Ohio River Valley, see it as a set of relationships that facilitated the flow of raw materials, finished products, people, and ideas. My advisor, Bob Jeske, believes it was more like a vaguely defined ideological network of localized polities, adapting to local and social, physical environments, expressed in the pan-regional stylistic motifs, raw materials, and artifact forms. I personally believe it was one of America's first cultural revolutions, a social and cultural movement enabled and encouraged by trade and reified through powerful objects, ceremonial gatherings, and mound building. I've heard colleagues compare it to the Renaissance, or more close to home, the ghost dance revival in the late 19th century led by the prophet Wovoka. What the ghost dance shares in similarity to Hopewell was that they were both messages of peace. There is little to no sign of violence during this period, and it's possible that the ceremonial use of tobacco and other herbs similar to the historic calumet may have played a part in that. I love art, and I love the way the Hopewell carved their stone pipes into effigies. Hopewell pipes are quite famous. A large collection of them are from Mound City in Ohio are currently at the British Museum, and they can be found in many of the regional American museums, such as the Cleveland Museum, the Field Museum, and the Milwaukee Public Museum. Here are some of my favorites. This beaver pipe has an actual beaver tooth inset and pearl insets for its eyes. I love this otter one. It has so much life to it. Look at that fish in its mouth. Other examples include bears, cats, dogs, small mammals, and a variety of birds and even human effigies. Birds and the many other animals such as frogs and beavers represented in Hopewell imagery could be perceived as liminal beings that move between the landscape domains, such as air to land, land to water, water to air. Another novel technology that was introduced early on in the Havana tradition was the production of bladelets using a technique not seen in Illinois before. Bladelets were produced from a pyramidal core with parallel ridges, allowing for uniform straight-sided blades to be removed either from direct or indirect percussion. Studies by Richard Yerkes, Logan Miller, and Kevin Nolan have shown that bladelets were used in a wide variety of cutting, scraping, drilling, perforating, and incising tasks, and in some places used for specialty craft production. I conducted a study a number of years ago on the bladelets recovered from the buried gardens of Campsville. I found a wide variety of bladelet forms and found that many of them had been intentionally snapped in halves or thirds. Some of the edges were also reworked to accommodate finger placement, which is really cool. Here's an image of some of the bladelets from the site. One thing you might notice is the range of chert colors, including that impressive serrated obsidian bladelet in the top row. Andy Fortier wrote a fantastic paper about Hopewell symbolism in 2008. I highly recommend reading it if you're interested in this aspect. He has a section about color called A People of Color and Glitter. People participating in the Hopewell interaction sphere incorporated color into many aspects of their life. One realm where it was very apparent is their stone tool assemblage. Fortier recognized cherts of almost every color at Dash Reeves in the American Bottom. He found white and gray Burlington cherts, dark blue Dongola and Cobden, black obsidian, yellow Knife River flint, red St. Genevieve chert, orange Catalin chert, and green Fernglen cherts. When shirts of certain colors weren't readily available, they would heat treat the material to get a desired color. For instance, Burlington shirt, which is typically white, turns red when heated to about 500 degrees Celsius. Even the lithic assemblage at the Cout site in DuPage County had a variety of shirt colors, including a piece of Knife River flint from Wyoming. It's not known whether shirts were used in specific rituals, embodied general meaning to individuals or lineages, or provided a form of social linkage between regions from which the shirts were derived, or all of the above. But we do know that some kind of extra local exchange or acquisition system associated with specific chert types occurred within Illinois during the Mid-Woodland period. This leads us to a key question in woodland studies. What was the significance of the mound? What were the attributes that characterized the places chosen for hunting, for homes, for ceremonies? What can their contents tell us about those who were buried and those who buried them? For answers to these questions, we can turn to our old friends from the Center of American Archaeology. Studies conducted by Stuart Strever, Jane Dykstra, Doug Charles, and others helped develop sociocultural models to explain the burial mound phenomenon by compiling vast amounts of data from the middle and late woodland sites up and down the Illinois and Mississippi rivers. The basis of their study is landscape. Landscape is one of my favorite ways in approaching archaeological problems. I like to think about it as the game board on which we play. The Native Americans who lived during this time likely saw their landscape as a living thing, composed of sacred features. Features of the landscape identified as sacred may take many forms: a tree, a spring, a rocky outcrop, the direction from which the sun rises. For the archaeologists, recovering meaning from such natural phenomena may seem an insurmountable task, but not all that is sacred is of natural origin. People construct and remodel elements of the landscape, and these processes often leave archaeological recoverable traces. Such residues facilitate our understanding of ancient societies, their politics, and their ideologies. In the riverine mid-continent of North America, places where corpses and valued items have been buried were used for millennia to divide and mark the landscape in ways that carried social, political, and religious meaning. Contributing to the complexity of mounds and other sacred features on the landscape is competing and cooperating interests between two or more sociocultural entities within the same society. For example, to balance the needs of an ancestral or political cult with the need of an earth or fertility cult, as described by Evans, Pritchard, Fortes, or Turner. The interplay between these two cultural forces may help explain why certain types of mounds, shrines, or pilgrimage centers may be located where they are and who had access to them. In 1999, Jane Dykstra and Doug Charles wrote a chapter in an edited volume that will help explain this phenomenon a little bit better. I'm going to read a few passages right now. In the Illinois Valley, mound groups dotted bluff crests 100 meters or more above the floodplain. Upon the floodplain were situated fewer but larger and more structurally complex mounds. In between these two locales were hamlets or small villages located on protected terraces at the base of bluffs adjacent to a stream. Many, though not all floodplain sites were organized around open spaces where audience once gathered for rites that positioned both the living and the dead within their worlds. These central places may have witnessed other collective rituals, included dances, celebrating seasonal change and the fertility of plants and animals, both real and mythical. Political and social in nature, such events anchored their participants within a complex cosmos, vertically and horizontally. This dichotomy suggests that bluff groups were the realm of specific ancestral lineages, where mortuary rituals aimed at connecting the individuals with their past, present, and future. Whereas floodplain groups were likely maintained by an earth or fertility cult group aimed at bringing people together to likely practice earth renewal ceremonies. Death was a part of both of these ritual realms, but likely played different roles. The Hopewell phase of the Middle Woodland period lasted for almost 300 years. We believe that the early, relatively simple structural formats and mounds were later embellished and expanded as communities attracted immigrants and inequalities emerged. Later mounds include empty tombs and are positioned near open spaces where audience may have viewed the rituals staged from elevated ramps that encircled the tomb structures. These rituals serve to anchor the middle woodland world, moving the dead across lofty platforms representing the upper world, through the flat disk of this world, into the dark subsurface underworld. A thin layer of light-colored sediments encircling the tomb at ground level is interpreted to represent this world.
We have here the 2,000-year-old surface. It's capped by a thin, prepared surface of soil that the Indians brought here before they began to deposit basket loads of soil. You see the outline of one of these basket loads here. There's another good example here. And there's others that stand out on this wall.
The riverine proximity for floodplain mounds may equally reflect the importance of water, bathing, and cleansing during world renewal rituals. Morgan in 1988 found that the birds of the air and the birds of the water are represented on many Hopewell ceramics, with vessels representing raptors always stacked below those of spoonbills, even though this placed smaller vessels below larger pots. All right, let's sum up what we learned here about the Middle Woodland period before we get into the demise of the Hopewell and the emergence of the loosely connected regional traditions during the late Woodland period. The Middle Woodland period starts around 2,200 years ago with the influx of new technologies, ideas, and a demand for exotic materials for the use in ritual purposes. Small villages and hamlets begin to be established in the parts of the valley and elsewhere in Illinois. They begin to participate in a national social cultural movement called the Hopewell Interaction Sphere, which connected regional traditions such as Havana, Marksville, and Scioto together using common symbology, ritual practices, and trade to maintain peace amongst the many groups living in the mid-continent. Regional differences are expressed through stone tool technology, mortuary practices, pottery construction and decoration, and their settlement and subsistence practices. Around 2,000 years ago, as Hopewell ceremonialism begins to take off, people from outside the valley begin to migrate into the area. But as the population of the Central Valley began to hit its carrying capacity, groups of people began to migrate out. People moved into the lower valley, as well as up the Illinois River Valley into northeastern Illinois and southeastern Wisconsin. Um, They also traveled to northwest Illinois, southeastern Michigan, bringing their traditions with them. These junior lineages were often tied together with the valley in a non-linear fashion, meaning the villages in between may not be closely related, despite their proximity. In some cases, the local populations adopted the new culture quickly and established their own base settlements and cemeteries like Norton Mound Group in Michigan. In other cases, such as the Waukesha focus people in southeastern Wisconsin, they kind of just keep doing what they're doing and only include a few aspects of the culture, such as pottery decoration or the use of burial mounds and altars. The trade of exotic items begins around 2,200 years ago, reaches a peak around 2,000 years ago, and begins to fade away about 1,800 years ago, until it completely disappears around 1,600 years ago. Whether it was cultural fatigue, a political breakdown, war, environmental degradation, or the introduction of a new way of thinking, the Hopewell interaction sphere eventually collapsed, leaving the people living in the different regions of the mid-continent kind of up to their own devices, no longer tied together by a shared ritual or trade. What happens next is actually quite fascinating, despite almost complete rejection of art and ritualistic displays of wealth. Let's start in the valley like usual and talk about what happens there. And then we can start to look outwards where I think the most interesting things are happening. In the transitional period between the middle woodland to late woodland period, there's an increasing reliance on local resources, particularly cultivated food. It appears that better cooking technology and a more familiar knowledge of horticultural practices help boost fertility rates. Settlements continued to be stable and sometimes large, again, especially in the larger valleys. The tendency for settlements to form clusters associated with prominent burial facilities also appears to persist. The geographic zone of residential settlement expanded significantly between 8,200 and 600, or roughly 1800 to 1400 years ago. After 600, population really began to take off, and we begin to see consistent occupation in places outside the valley near large wetlands, such as northeastern Illinois. Thus, by 8600, the region's people were more sedentary, more widely settled, more horticultural, and more numerous than ever before. Changes in household, village, and local social organization are likely to have taken place, the character and causes of which remain matters of debate. The mortuary data point to a greater consistency in the ways that entire segments of populations were treated at death, with some segmental divisions apparently cutting across lines of age and gender. This essentially means that more people were buried the same way in the same place. During this shift away from Hopewell, two major changes occur in the way that people make their pottery. One important change is a severe reduction in the types and amount of decoration on pottery throughout the region. During the early late woodland period, there was a trend towards greater similarities in decorative practices over increasingly large areas. The same trend is evident in the widespread adoption of a single range of vessel construction practices throughout the region. Some of the changes may be explainable as a consequence of changes in the way pots were used or in the way ideas were transmitted, but some clearly are not explainable in this way. It appears plausible that changes in core social beliefs and practices that linked households, villages, and entire multi-village communities to each other across the entire region also shifted. Second, pottery becomes increasingly thinner, taller, and stronger. The overall shift to thinner walled vessels instead appears related to changes in vessel use. The shift involves several changes in manufacturing technology, all of which indicate that the potters were making vessels able to handle increasingly thermal stressful conditions of use. This shift occurred in a lockstep with the increased use of cultivated seeds, indicating a coevolution of cooking technology and cultivation practices. Dried seeds required longer cooking times at higher temperatures and more water in the pot than do perhaps any other foodstuffs for their nutritional value to be released. Skeletal indicators of the consumption of highly processed starches, in fact, do increase among juvenile skeletons. This has been shown by Bijkstra and Cook. Bijkstra also posits that the concurrent increase in human fertility resulted from a reduction in average weaning age due to the use of starchy gruels as weanling foods, which is really cool. The second major transformation of the late woodland period is the introduction of the bow and arrow. Early Havana Hopewell projectile point knives were pretty large, but by the end of the middle woodland period, most of these point forms were miniaturized. This trend was recognized by Montet White in 1969, and we see this trend occur not only in the valley, but everywhere. Despite the trend towards smaller tools, it wasn't until 1350 years ago, or roughly 8650, that the bow and arrow was introduced into Illinois. Shortly thereafter, things get interesting, and not necessarily in a good way. Victims of violence are known from the early Archaic period onward. However, these sites do not occur with any regularity until the late Middle or to late Archaic periods. But during the woodland period, there is little evidence of warfare at all, supporting the argument that Hopewell was a peaceful movement aimed at bringing people together. By the last half of the first millennium AD, however, intergroup social relations deteriorated to the point where violent deaths once again occurred in regularity in some parts of the eastern woodlands. This was no doubt related to the introduction of the bow and arrow. Early bow and arrow points varied in size, form, and notching, possibly a reflection of the experimental process. Early arrowheads included coster corner notch, clunk side notch, shield spikes, raccoon side notch, and jack's reef. Madison triangular points later became the standard arrowhead technology, likely because they were cheap and easy to make and highly effective at killing. At the Peak Clunk site in the lower valley, 2 individuals were found buried in a late woodland mound with early projectile points lodged into their bones. Violence has also been recognized at nearby Shield and Coster mounds as well. In some cases, evidence of hand-to-hand combat and the killing of women and children is present. The burials at Clunk were intrusive into an earlier late woodland mound and shows a continuity in sacred places from the end of the Hopewell on. Mound 8 at Clunk was built in several episodes. First, a small mound was built with only a few burials. Then a second mound was built not too far from it. Then a large crematory was built in between these two mounds where a massive fire took place. Burials were then placed on the crematory afterwards, and then the whole thing was capped off in a large oval-shaped mound. The number of artifacts included with the burials were much smaller, and they were not as ostentatious, but there is continuation of the importance of fire, shell, and smoking, evidenced by burnt soils, shell pendants, and spoons and claystone pipes. Comparisons between Clunk, Coster, and Shield show that there is a growing differences in the way people were being treated after death, but shells and pipes are a constant. As competition grows in the major valleys, warfare breaks out, and we see people take several different strategies to adapt to the new cultural landscape. Some groups consolidate, build bigger villages, and in some rare early cases, fortify their villages. Others run for the hills, literally. In northeastern Illinois, we do not see evidence of violence as clearly as we do in the valley, but we do see some evidence of territory restriction and efforts to space out as much as possible. A major locus of activity during the late Woodland period in northern Illinois was the upper Illinois Valley from Starved Rock to the Chicago Portage. We see the most growth and stability in populations in this area during this time, but we also see many smaller villages and cemeteries being established along its tributaries, such as the Fox and Des Plaines rivers. In northern Illinois, the transition from Havana to Lake Woodland is murky. We do not have enough well-dated sites from this time period or enough artifactual data to piece together a clear sequence of phases. What we do know is at the very end of the Havana phase, Steuben Ware and Steuben Points appear in northern Illinois. This phase is named after the Steuben site a little downriver from Starved Rock and lasted to about 8600. Steuben ware is very similar to Havana ware, but lacks most of the decoration of its predecessor. Steuben wares are found throughout northern Illinois as well as south central Wisconsin along the Rock and Fox rivers, suggesting free movement and exchange between these two areas at this time. Steuben is eventually abandoned when new ware types with globular forms are developed in the valley as well as in south central Wisconsin. Cord-marked, cord-and-press globular bowls become popular around 650, 700, right around the same time the bow and arrow are introduced and may have come as a package from the eastern Great Lakes. This period in northern Illinois is known as the Des Plaines complex, but is likely related in part to the Horicon phase in Wisconsin and possibly the Meyer-Dixon phase in Central Valley. Madison ware is the most common early late woodland ware found in northeastern Illinois and southeastern Wisconsin. Madison wares are frequently associated with effigy mounds, and there were in fact several effigy mounds in northeastern Illinois. And there are still a few left along the Rock and Pecatonica rivers near Rockford. Okay, so quick roundup here for late middle woodland, early late woodland. We have an increased reliance on gardening, better pottery, more population, and a rejection of Hopewell ideology and social organization. In the valley, mound building continues, but changes in the way mounds are built, how people are interred, and what is interred with them. Outside the valley, mound building continues as well, but to a much lesser extent until around 1300 years ago when the bow and arrow and corn is introduced into the American bottom in Illinois Valley. The next 300 years, this pattern of more people, more conflict, and more migration culminates into what we know as the Mississippian period, the next big transformation in Native American history. This last portion of the late woodland period from 700 to 1000 varies a lot throughout the state, and I don't have the time to talk about all the changes, but we can at least discuss what is happening in northeastern Illinois during this time. In northern Illinois, you have at least two competing complexes overlapping each other. In the northern portion, you have the effigy mound tradition, and in the south, you have the Illinois Valley Lake Woodland complexes, such as the Des Plaines complex. The effigy mound tradition was first established in southern Wisconsin and parts of northern Illinois near the Mississippi River, and spread throughout much of Wisconsin and parts of northern Illinois, such as the Rock River, Fox River, and Des Plaines rivers, around 700. Early and middle woodland mounds are interpreted as places where ceremonies centered around world renewal took place, as well as delineate territory and honor the ancestors. It is believed that effigy mounds served many of these same purposes, suggesting continuity and an awareness and understanding of the ancestors' sacred places. Effigy mounds are typically found in groups consisting of not only effigies, but conical, linear, and compound mounds, and may consist of hundreds of individual mounds in some places, such as Cranberry Creek or Effigy Mound National Park. Some mounds can also reach epic proportions, such as the large bird effigy on Lake Mendota in Madison, Wisconsin, with a wingspan of over 500 feet. Effigy mound groups are typically found on high ground near water, such as lakes, rivers, wetlands, and springs, with a few exceptions, and are thought to be an element of choosing a location to build a mound group. The Des Plaines complex or phase was defined a long time ago to describe the cultural expressions of the late Woodland period in the upper Illinois Valley. It is recognized in the archaeological record by the presence of grit-tempered, cord-marked, or smoothed-over cord-marked collared and uncollared globular bowls with little to no decoration. Madison triangular points, an expedient tool tradition, humpback bifaces, a burial program consisting of small conical or oval-shaped burial mounds, such as Winfield mounds, with bundle burials with very few artifacts aside from shells or intrusive burials into older mounds. A few effigy mound sites have been recorded in northeastern Illinois, however, none of them are still visible. There were at least two effigy groups along the Fox as far south as Aurora, a possible serpent mound along the upper Des Plaines River, and a possible lizard mound somewhere near where Wrigley Field is now located. Extant effigy mound groups can be found along the Rock and Pecatonica rivers, as well as the upper Illinois or the upper Mississippi Valley near Galena. By far, though, the majority of effigy mounds can be found in southern Wisconsin. Around 800 years ago, we see another shift in ceramic construction and decoration and the introduction of corn into the diet. This period can be considered the late portion of the Des Plaines complex and likely related to the Wisconsin Kokoski phase. It's not very clear what's going on at this time in northeastern Illinois, but it is clear that the population was growing and that the Fox River Valley was an important link between southeastern Wisconsin and the Illinois Valley. Collard wares have been found most famously at Starved Rock and nearby sites, as well as Aztalan, the miniature Cahokia located in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, approximately 135 miles north of Starved Rock. There would have been a couple of different ways to travel between these two places. First, from Aztalan, one could canoe down the Rock River to Rockford, then travel almost straight south by foot until you reach the Illinois River. Or one could travel 25 miles east from Aztalan by foot to reach the headwaters of the Fox River, and then travel the remaining distance by canoe to the Illinois River. It's likely that both routes were used, as we see collard wares occur in the Rockford area, as well as the Chain of Lakes area along the Fox. Salkin suggests in his study of the Kokoski phase that it was more closely related to the cultures of the southern Great Lakes than its predecessors, who typically looked to the Mississippi or Illinois valleys for inspiration. Collardware pottery, corn agriculture, and triangular points seem to enter the region as a unit. However, there's limited direct evidence to support this claim at the moment. Finally, around 1,000 years ago, influences from the American bottom begin to make their way into northeastern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. The terminal late woodland, early Mississippian culture known as Langford were growing corn, but also sticking with their broad-based diet to supplement the corn. In the upper Illinois Valley, they were eventually incorporated into later Mississippian groups such as Fisher, who were the first to use shell tempering agents in their pottery. Well, that is roughly 2,000 years of human history in a nutshell. I wish I had more time to dive into all the intricacies of the period and tie together what was happening in Illinois versus other regions, but I'll leave that up to you to discover. Thank you for listening to me. If you have any questions about the Woodland Period or any of the sites I mentioned today, I would be happy to answer your questions. You can reach me at pjgeraci@uwm.edu. Thanks and take care.